She was 22, and dismissed without a character. She walked out of the house at Fennel Reach on a Tuesday morning in November with everything she owned: a gray stuff gown turned twice at the cuff, a tin box of her mother's needles and pins, and 9 shillings and fourpence knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. Her name was Esther Marrow. By the middle of that afternoon, she had walked the 4 miles of coast road down to the harbour at Corvan Hythe, where her aunt kept a chandler's shop, and where, before the week was out, the whole Quay would have its laugh at her expense, and then call the laugh a kindness. But what none of them knew, and what not one of them had troubled to check in the 40 years the place had stood shut, was that behind the double doors of the Customs House long room, under a crown seal nobody had ever thought worth the breaking, there was something that would turn every smirk on that Quay to silence. Settle in with a cup of tea, and let the fire burn low, because this is a story that takes its time and is best heard slowly. If you like quiet stories told this way, subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. Esther Marrow had been born in a low brick cottage on the Salt Road above Braidwick, the only surviving child of a ropemaker named Thomas Marrow and his wife Ruth. Behind the cottage ran her father's rope walk, a long shed of tarred boards 300 feet from end to end, where hemp was spun into yarn and yarn laid into rope for the smacks and luggers working out of the Hythe. Her first memory in the world was the smell of that shed, tar and hemp and cold salt together. Her second was of her father walking slowly backwards down the length of the walk, with the fibre paying out from the bundle at his waist, which is how rope was made then, and had been made there for 90 years. He used to say that a man who could not walk backwards steadily had no business making anything at all. He taught her the measures before she was 7. A fathom was 6 feet, and rope was sold by the fathom and paid for by the pound, and she was never once allowed to guess at either. She walked out every coil twice while the buyer stood watching her lips move. Her mother taught her the other half. Ruth Marrow was a sailmaker's daughter out of Sedge Point, a small, thin, upright woman with a beautiful hand, and she kept the rope walks accounts in a stitched book with a marbled cover. Every coil sold and every pound of hemp bought was written down the same evening, in a hand a stranger could read at arm's length. She taught Esther to add a column downward and then add it again upward, so that the sum proved itself, and she taught her that a figure written in pencil is an opinion, and a figure written in ink is a fact. Ruth Marrow died in the fever winter of 1843, when Esther was 9. 3 days before the end, she had her daughter bring the stitched book to the bed, and made the child write in the last week's entries herself while she watched. What she said then, Esther kept for the rest of her life. "Write it down while it is still true," her mother said. "Nobody in this world can argue with ink." After that there was only the two of them, and the trade was already dying. Machine-laid rope came in from the mills at Ipswich, cheaper than a man could spin it by hand, and by 1846 3 of the old walks along that coast stood empty with the doors off their hinges. Thomas Marrow sold his hackles and his tarring copper, and took work as a lighterman on the river, which is heavy wet work for a man who has spent his life on dry boards. He got a cough in the first winter of it, and never lost it. He died in the March of 1847, aged 41, owing £11 3 shillings, which his tools just covered. So Esther Marrow went into service at 13. She walked to Fennel Reach with a bundle and a letter from the curate, and was taken on as kitchen maid in the house of Mr. Anselm Crail, shipping agent, at £3.10 a year, and her keep. The woman who ran that house was Mrs. Sarah Bidwell, housekeeper, aged 61, of Sedge Point, and she is the reason for everything that comes after. Mrs. Bidwell had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had no softness left to spare on anybody. She did not comfort people. She taught them things instead, on the theory that a skill lasts longer than a kind word and cannot be taken back. She taught the girl to scald and scour, to lay a fire that would draw in a bad chimney, and to keep a copper bright with sand and wood ash. But the heart of it, the thing she cared about, was the weighing. There were brass scales on the bench in the still room at Fennel Reach, and nothing came into that house without going on to them first. Coal, flour, sugar, tallow, tea, all of it weighed at the door in front of the man who brought it, and the weight written into the book before the ticket was signed. Esther thought it fussy at first. Then, in her second winter, she weighed a ton of house coal and made it 1800 weight and 3/4, and the carter went away white about the mouth and came back next morning with the balance, and no argument at all. "They are not thieves, most of them," Mrs. Bidwell said afterwards. "They are simply not watched. A woman who can weigh, and a woman who can write down what she weighed, will never be wholly at anybody's mercy." There was one more rule, and it was the one she repeated most often. Never put your name to a paper you have not read all the way to the bottom, and never let a man hurry you over the reading of it. Mrs. Bidwell said that particular sentence the way other people say a prayer. Sarah Bidwell died in her sleep in the spring of 1853. Esther, who was 19 then, was given the keys and the household books, and her wages were raised to £9 a year. For 3.5 years she ran that house, kept its accounts in ink, checked every tradesman's bill against the weight actually delivered, and saved what she could in a tin box under a loose board. Mr. Anselm Crail was 78 and had a bad heart and no children. He died in his chair on the 4th of November, 1856, with his spectacles still on. Within the fortnight his nephew came down from town to settle the estate. Mr. Vance Crail was a brisk, pink, impatient man who did his arithmetic on his cuff. He meant to sell the house and everything in it before Christmas, and he began by clearing the servants. The cook and the coachman were given a month's wages and their characters. Esther, who was owed £3 5 shillings for the quarter just ended, made the mistake of asking for it in writing. She did it politely, on half a sheet, with the amount, the dates, and a line for his signature, exactly as Mrs. Bidwell would have done it. He read it standing up, and told her that a young woman who wrote out demands like a solicitor's clerk had got above her station, and that she might consider her wages forfeited against the general disorder of accounts he had not looked at and did not intend to look at. He refused her a character. That was the part that mattered. Without a written character from her last place, no respectable household within 30 miles would take her on at any wage, and both of them knew it, and only one of them cared. So she walked 4 miles down the coast road to Corvin Hythe, where her mother's sister lived. Her aunt, Mrs. Hannah Sparrow, kept a chandler's shop on the Quay with her husband Robert, selling tar and tallow and cordage to the boats. They had 2 grown sons in the back room, no space, and, it became clear inside 10 minutes, no intention. Her uncle by marriage said the word burden, not to her, but near enough to her, and then said he had not meant it in that way. She slept on sacking in the storeroom among the tar barrels, with the smell of her whole childhood around her. In the morning she went along the quay to the harbour office to ask whether anybody wanted a woman who could keep books. The harbour office at Corvin Hythe was one warm room with a stove and a long table, and that morning 11 men and 2 boys in it, because the wind was in the northeast and nothing was working. Mr. Rundle, the harbour master, heard her out with his thumbs in his waistcoat. There was no place for a clerk, and had not been for 9 years. But there was, he said, one thing going begging, and he said it looking round the room first to be sure everybody was listening. The old customs house still stood at the far end of the quay, past the seawall on the old height. The establishment had been removed to the deep water at Neston Ness in the year 1816, and the building had been shut ever since. The Crown let it on a repairing lease at 2 guineas a year, and the board's agent had been advertising for a tenant for 11 years without finding one. Because the ground floor took the spring tides in through a silted culvert, and the lease bound whoever signed it to keep the whole thing wind and watertight at their own cost. 2 guineas was nothing. The repairs were everything. No man on that quay would touch it. Somebody at the back of the room said that here at last was the tenant they had all been waiting for, and the room laughed. It was not cruel laughter, particularly, which somehow made it worse. It was the easy laughter of men who have found a small entertainment on a cold morning. Miss Rundle, playing to the room, took the lease paper out of the drawer, laid it on the table, and offered her the pen. Esther Marrow picked up the paper first. She read it all the way to the bottom, both sides, standing there, while 13 people watched her and the stove ticked. It took 4 or 5 minutes. By the end of the 3rd minute the laughing had stopped, because there is something faintly unnerving about a person who actually reads. Then she signed it, in a clear round hand, with the date, and her mother's way of underlining the year. The clerk gave her 3 keys on a ring of iron wire. Behind her, as she went out, she heard a man offer a shilling that she would not last a fortnight, and another take him up on it at a fortnight and a day. That bet was the only investment anybody on that quay made in her for a year and a half. She did not go out to the building that afternoon. She bought a straw pallet from a widow in the parish for 8pence, and spent the rest of the day at her aunt's table with a sheet of paper, working out what she had and what she owed. 9 shillings and 4pence, 2 guineas a year to the Crown, payable at midsummer, which gave her 7 months. A building she had never been inside. In the morning she hired Jem Coble, aged 11, who kept a donkey and a flat cart on the quay, and would carry anything anywhere for 3pence, and the 2 of them went out along the quay with her box and her pallet, and a sack of coal she had bought at 5pence. The quay at Corvan Hythe runs 1.25 miles out from the town along the top of the seawall. Wet cobble the whole way, hollowed in the middle by 200 years of iron-shod cartwheels. That morning there was hoarfrost standing in every joint between the stones, a fine white lacework over the black, and the tide was making hard against the wall, so that spray came over in slow white handfuls and fell across the cobbles ahead of them. The sky out over the estuary was one solid bruise of storm cloud, and in the middle of it a break had opened, and the light was coming down through the break in long straight bars all the way to the water. The boy stopped the donkey where the quay widened, set her box down on the stones, took his 3pence, and went. And Esther Marrow stood there in the cold with the sea breaking on her right hand, and looked at the thing she had signed for. The customs house stood square across the end of the quay, and it was enormous. 4 stories of dark tide-stained brick, 11 bays long, with a stone pediment over the middle, and a hoist beam standing out from the top floor above 2 ranks of shuttered loading doors. Its roofline went up hard against the storm sky. Its whole mass sat flat against the weather, like something built to be argued with. The cobbled way ran out from under her boots straight to its main door. There was weed to the height of her knee on the seaward corner, bladderwrack drying in the brick joints, and a black tide mark across the front of the building as level and deliberate as a ruled line. Beside her in the shingle, half sunk and orange with rust, lay the drum of a winch that had not turned since before she was born. And on the first floor, in the middle of the front, 2 windows were burning amber. She stood a long while looking at them. It was only the low sun, of course, coming through the break in the cloud behind her, and catching the old crown glass in those 2 frames and nowhere else. She worked that out inside a minute. But the fact of it stayed with her all the same. 2 warm, lit windows in 40 years of shut brick. As though somebody in there had heard the cart on the cobbles and put a lamp in the glass. Those 2 windows were the long room. She did not know that yet. She turned the key twice before it moved. Inside, the ground floor was a cold cathedral of a place, flagged with 18-foot ceilings and pillars of brick, and standing water 2 inches deep at the seaward end where the floor had settled. The culvert that should have drained it was silted to the crown. Weed lay flattened on the flags in long comb streaks. Everything at knee height and below was black and slick. Everything above it was merely filthy, which she counted as good news. She counted the rooms that first afternoon, because counting was what she did instead of despairing. 19 rooms over 4 floors and a coal store. 11 had doors that shut, 4 had windows that were whole, and she could see daylight down 3 of the 7 chimneys. On the top floor, in the corner where the slates had gone, she stood in 40 years of gull straw and looked up through the hole at the sky and did the only piece of arithmetic that mattered. The roof was the whole battle. Everything else in that building was waiting to see what she did about the roof. That night she made her first fire in the clerk's room on the 2nd floor, which was small, dry, and had a door that latched. She cleared the flue with a bundle of furs on a line, laid the fire with 3 dry sticks off the top floor rafters, and lit it. It drew. She sat back on her heels and watched the smoke go up the way it was supposed to go, and that was the first thing in a year that had. Then she got out her mother's stitched account book, ruled it into columns, and wrote down the pallet at 8p, the coal at 5p, the boy at 3p, and the balance remaining, which was 8 shillings even. Something came in out of the coal store the second night. It was a ginger Tom, thin as a hinge, with a torn ear and an entirely businesslike attitude, and it walked past her, sat down in front of her fire, and began to wash. She gave it the dripping off her bread. It stayed 11 years. She called it tallow, because of the color and because of her aunt's shop. For 3 weeks, she did nothing but the plainest work in the world. She swept the flags. She scraped the weed. She dug the silt out of the culvert with a borrowed spade, 4 barrow loads a day, and learned by watching the water where the flood tide came in and how far up. She wrote the tide down every day for 21 days, high and low, until she had the harbour's clock by heart. She lived on bread, potatoes and salt herring at a halfpenny each, and spent in those 3 weeks £1 2 shillings and 7p, all of it written down. And on the first floor, at the head of the broad stair, there was a pair of double doors she had not opened. They were painted the dull green of the Board of Customs, with a heavy brass lock plate, and across the join between them ran a strip of parchment tape, and where the tape met the frame there was a wafer of red wax, the size of a crown piece, with the crown stamped into it. The tape was brittle and brown. The wax was whole. Nobody had broken that seal since the establishment was removed, and there was no key for that lock on her ring of 3. She could have put her shoulder to it in the first week. A great many people would have. What she did instead was write a letter. She wrote it on Mrs. Bidwell's principle, which was that the cheapest thing in the world is to ask first. She wrote to the board's agent at Neston Ness, stating her name, the date of her lease, the situation of the sealed doors, and her request for direction. Postage was 2p. The reply came back 9 days later from a clerk named Mr. Otway, and ran to 5 lines. The building had been struck off the Crown's list of stations in 1822, and the fabric of the house, with all that stood within it, passed with the repairing lease to the tenant thereof, who might do as she pleased with any part of it. She read that letter 4 times, then folded it into the cover of her account book, where it stayed. On the 14th of December she walked into Braidwick and bought a small pry bar from Mr. Keene, Hollis, Smith, aged 60, of that village, at 1 shilling and 3pence, and a horn lantern and a tallow candle for 9pence the pair. She broke the wafer with her thumbnail, and the wax came away in 3 pieces and fell on the boards, and 40 years ended just like that, with a small dry sound and no witnesses at all. The doors had swollen. She worked the pry bar in at the bottom of the join, gently, the way her father had taught her to open anything that mattered, and lifted rather than levered, and the left-hand door came off its bind with a groan that ran the whole length of the building. Cold air came out at her, and dust, and the smell of old paper, and old tar and dry stone. The long room ran 60 feet from end to end, and it was the finest room she had ever stood in. There were 5 tall windows down the seaward wall, and the low sun was in the 2 middle ones exactly as it had been on the morning she arrived, so that the whole room lay in 2 long amber bars of dusty light, with cold blue between them. There was a plaster ceiling with a molded cornice, and a long mahogany counter worn hollow in 3 places by the elbows of men 40 years dead. And in the middle of the room, on a stone bench built up from the floor below, stood the king's beam. She had never seen one, but she knew what it was, because it was only her still room scales at Fennel Reach grown to the size of a cart, a great iron beam 8 feet across, brass-tipped, hung in a wrought frame, with 2 shallow pans below it and a rack of board stamped weights beside it from 1/4 of an ounce up to 1/2 a hundredweight. She put her hand out and touched the beam, and it swung sweetly on 40 years of dust and settled level. She sat down on the floor of that room in her wet boots and cried for about 1.5 minutes, and then she got up and went to work, because the light was going. It was 3 days later that she found the rest of it, and she found it the way Mrs. Bidwell had taught her to find anything, which was by being thorough about a dull job. She was washing the paneling behind the weighing bench with soap and warm water, working along on her knees, and one panel answered her knuckles hollow. It was 3 feet by 4 and papered flush with the rest. The paper cut along the join with a knife so neatly that from 6 feet away there was nothing to see. There was a keyhole under the paper, and no key, but the panel was hung on pin hinges, and the pins had been driven from below, and she had a small pry bar and the whole evening, and at about 9 o'clock that night she lifted the panel out and held the lantern up. It was a cupboard 4 shelves deep, and it was full. 61 yards of Valenciennes lace, folded in oiled paper, and packed in a tin case with a lid that still fitted, as white as the day it came off the loom. 4 lead-lined chests of Bohea tea, 60 pounds weight together, the tea inside dry as sand. A roll of India silk and sailcloth. 2 dozen bottles of French brandy in straw with the wax hole on the necks. A flat wooden case, corded and sealed, holding Spanish silver coin taken out of a lugger on the bar in the year 1811. And on the top shelf, alone, a vellum-bound book with a strap and a brass clasp. It was the seizure book of the port of Corvinhythe, and it ran from 1791 to 1816. Every cask, bale and case ever condemned at that station, and never claimed, written up in order with the date, the vessel, the master, and the appraised value. For the first 25 years the hand was a man's, cramped and impatient. For the last 11 it was a woman's, small and clear and beautiful. And it did not miss a single week. Inside the front board, held under the strap, was a letter folded in three and sealed with thread and a wafer, and written across the outside of it, in that same small, clear hand, were the words, "To whoever next holds the keys of this house." Esther Marrow read it once through in silence. Then she stood up in the middle of that 60-foot room with the lantern on the counter and the cat sitting on the weighing bench, and she read it aloud in the empty room, because it seemed to her that it had been waiting a long time to be heard. My husband, Edmund Threadgold, was collector of this port for 19 years and died in this room in the November of 1805. I was not permitted his place, being a woman, and no man could be got to come to a station this small, and so for 11 years I kept the book, weighed the goods, wrote the accounts, and locked the cupboard, and drew no salary of any kind, and was thanked by nobody. His nephew took the plate and the furniture and the money, and sent me a letter regretting there was no provision. There is provision. It is behind this panel, and it is mine to leave, for the board never claimed it, and the owners never came. I leave it to whoever holds the keys after me, whoever that may be, and I hope with all my heart it is somebody who was given this house, because nobody else wanted it. Weigh honestly. Write it in ink. Do not let them hurry you. It was signed Charity Threadgold, and dated the 9th of June, 1816. There was more, and the more was the part that changed her life, but it was not in the cupboard. It was in the end papers of the seizure book, where Charity Threadgold had copied out, in the same clear hand, the covenant that came with the building. The King's Beam and the right of weighing for the harbour of Corvan Hythe were appurtenant to the customs house, and went with the house and with whoever legally held it. Every cargo landed on that quay was, by the terms of the covenant, to be weighed at the public beam, and the keeper of the beam was entitled to take the beam dues, which were a halfpenny in the hundredweight, and to keep the beam book. For 40 years, nobody had held the house. So for 40 years, every merchant on that quay had weighed his own goods on his own scales, in his own yard, with nobody watching, and had thought nothing about it at all. She did not go running down the quay with the news. She went instead and got it made certain, which took her the whole of January and cost £3 1 shilling. She had the goods appraised by an auctioneer at Neston Ness, and their sale advertised in the county paper for 2 months, so that any owner or heir might claim them, and not one soul came forward. She had Mr. Otway confirm the covenant in writing on stamped paper, and she wrote to the county inspector of weights and measures, Mr. Pettifer, who came out along the quay in the sleet with his standards in a mahogany box, tested the great beam and every weight in the rack, condemned 2, stamped the rest, and entered her name in the county register as keeper of the public beam at Corvan Hythe. His fee was 11 shillings, and she paid it in a room where the roof was still open to the sky. The goods sold in the March. The lace fetched 128 guineas by itself, being a make nobody had been able to buy legally in 40 years. The silver made £91, the brandy 18, the silk £22 10, the tea £9 4 shillings. Behind the cases, wrapped in a shawl, there was also a canvas bag holding 112 sovereigns, which was Charity Threadgold's own money. 11 years of a salary she was never paid, saved a coin at a time. Esther counted them onto the counter of the long room twice, and then a third time, upward, to prove it. Altogether it came to something over £460, at a time when a slater with 2 men under him earned perhaps £60 in a year. She spent it on the building, in the right order, which is the order any coastal builder will give you if you ask. The roof came first. Mr. Ambrose Peck, Slater, aged 51, of Maramend, came out with 2 men and a boy in the second week of April and was on that roof for 19 days. 4,000 Welsh slates at £3, 12 the thousand, new lead in both valleys, 11 rafters spliced, and 4 renewed, and the whole seaward slope relaid, because the old nails had rusted to nothing in the salt. The price agreed beforehand, in writing, was £51 and their dinners, and when he finished 4 days early, she paid him the £51 and no less. A house without a sound roof cannot be mended from underneath. Then, the range. Mr. Hollis the smith set a new fire back and a crane in the old officer's kitchen, and she bought a second-hand kitchen range at a sale at Neston Ness for £4.10. Mr. Cully, sweep, aged 33, of Corvan Hythe, did all 7 flues at £1 the flue. From the end of May there was hot water in that house every day of the week, and bread baked in it, and a warm room to sit in. Then the water. Mr. Silas Kell, mason, aged 44, of Corvan Hythe, who had laughed with the rest of them in the harbour office and had the grace to say so, raised the sill of the great sea door by 2 courses of granite, reset the threshold, and hung on the culvert mouth an iron tide flap that Mr. Hollis forged to his measure, so that the water could run out at the ebb and could not come back in at the flood. It cost £8.15, and it ended in 1 week the thing that had made the building a joke for 40 years. The spring tides came in the April following, and the ground floor stayed dry, and about 9 people walked out along the quay to see it, and said very little. Mr. Elias Van, ship's carpenter, aged 47, of Braid Wick, laid a new pitch pine floor at the seaward end and rehung the long room doors so they swung on a finger. Mr. John Bloy, glazier, aged 38, of Hollow Reach, set 81 new panes at 6pence the pane and releaded the 5 long-room windows himself. The 2 middle windows still take the low sun in the afternoon. That has not changed, and will not. And last, in the autumn, the slipway and the quay steps, cleared of 40 years of weed and reset true by 2 men from the village at 3pence the foot, so that a boat could come alongside her wall at any state of the tide and put goods ashore at her door. She kept every account in ink in her mother's stitched book, paid every man on the day the work was done, and never once asked for a discount, and word of both those habits went along that coast faster than the news of the money. The beam opened for public weighing on the 1st of October, 1857. She did not announce it in the alehouse. She had the covenant, the board's letter, and the inspector's certificate copied fair by a solicitor at Neston Ness, Mr. Marchant, at a guinea, and sent 1 copy to Mr. Rundle at the harbour office, and 1 to each of the 4 merchants who landed goods at Corvan Hythe, with a note giving the date, the hours, and the rate, which was the covenant's own halfpenny in the hundredweight, and not a farthing more. The first master to bring a cargo to the beam was Mr. Jonas Crake of the Ketch Providence, who had never met her, had no opinion about any of it, and wanted his coal weighed because he had been short-weighted twice that summer. She weighed 62 tons in a morning, gave him a written ticket for each draught, entered it all in the beam book, and took £2 1 shilling and 8pence. He looked at his ticket a long moment, and then said the only thing anybody said out loud about it that whole first year. "There has not been an honest scale on this harbour in my lifetime," he said. After that it went the way these things go, which is quietly and all at once. A buyer at Neston Ness began asking for a Corvan Hythe beam ticket before he would settle. Then a second did. Then the insurers did. By the spring of 1858, cargo landed on that quay without a ticket from her book was worth less than cargo that had one. And the merchants who had weighed in their own yards for 40 years brought their goods along the wet cobbles to her door. Her uncle by marriage came in the June with a lighter of tallow and stood in the line behind two other men with his hat in his hands. She weighed his tallow, entered it, wrote his ticket, and took his fourpence. She did not say one word to him that she had not said to the man in front of him, and she never afterwards told anybody in that town what he had called her in his back room in November. That is what the reckoning looked like, a fair weight and a written ticket, and nothing else at all. Mr. Rundle was obliged to bring the harbour's own coal to her beam like everybody else, and did, and paid, and had his name entered in her book on the same page as the rest. The two men who had laid a shilling on how long she would last settled the bet in the spring, and neither of them ever collected, because by then the joke had become a thing nobody could quite remember having found funny. In her first full year the beam took £87 4 shillings and 9 pence. In her fourth year it took 230. She let the top 2 floors as bonded storage to a corn factor at £40 a year, and the coal store to the lifeboat crew for nothing. Vance Crail never wrote. Not that year, not ever. He had held her cheaply and let her go for the price of a quarter's wages he did not intend to pay, and it had not cost him a night's sleep, and he never knew one thing about what became of her. She was not avenged. She was simply somewhere else, doing better work, in a building he could not have afforded to repair. In the September of 1858, she paid Mr. Silas Kell £2 4 shillings to cut and set a stone in the churchyard at Corvin Hythe, over a grave that had been unmarked for 31 years. It carried the name of Charity Threadgold, the years she was born and died, and beneath that 4 words Esther chose herself and had cut deep, because the salt takes shallow letters off a stone in 20 years on that coast. She kept the beam book. That is all it said. The long room is still there. On a winter afternoon, when the tide is making and the cloud breaks over the estuary and the light comes down in bars, the 2 middle windows on the first floor burn amber all the way along the quay, so that anybody walking out from the town would swear somebody in there has just set a lamp in the glass. The chimney smokes straight up into the cold. There is a swept floor, a laid fire, a ginger cat asleep on the stone bench, and a great iron beam hanging level and true above him. Almost every one of us has been handed at some point a thing that other people were quick to call worthless. A house nobody wanted, a job nobody else would take. And the world is very quick to tell you what a thing is worth from the outside, from the quay, at a distance, in bad weather, without ever going in at the door and putting a lamp up and looking at what is actually there. Charity Threadgold worked 11 years for nothing in a room full of other people's money, and took the only revenge left to her, which was to leave what she had to a stranger she would never meet. And Esther Marrow read a lease all the way to the bottom while 13 people laughed at her, and then walked out along 1.25 miles of frozen cobbles in November to look at a flooded building, and stayed. Neither of them raised their voice once. So here is the question we would leave you with tonight. What has been handed to you that others were quick to call a joke, and what might you find in it if you took a lamp and a small pry bar and went and looked behind its plainest wall? Tell us in the comments. We read every one of them in the evenings, by our own fires. Walk gently, keep your accounts in ink, and we will see you again along the next salt road.